Let's go.
Media. Let's see.
Launch.
Share. Yeah. Said Zoom moved some things around, so it might take me a second to find some stuff. There we go. Everybody can hear that. Here we go. Good evening. Good evening. Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club, Greatest Generation Live for Thursday, June 27th. I'm your host. Well, not your host. I guess I'm your co-host, Sean Hall. I'm Director of Programming with the VBC. Seeing some familiar faces here in the room tonight. We have a great program lined up for you. And I will let Glenn introduce Jan in just a minute. But Glenn, how are you doing this evening?
Doing excellent. Beautiful, beautiful evening in Pittsburgh.
It is absolutely gorgeous here this evening. And for those of you who may be new to us, we are the VBC, and we are a nonprofit based in Pittsburgh, PA. And our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. We've been doing it since 2008, excuse me. And this program and all of our programs are really made possible by your generous support, not only by attending, but also we invite you to be donors of the VBC. You can do that by checking out our website, www.veteransbreakfastclub.org. And one other thing that I would like to share real quick before we get to the main event is a new thing that we have on our website, which we're very excited about. We recently started a veterans tribute wall. So I pulled up this webpage here. You can go right to our website, like I said, veteransbreakfastclub.org, click over to tributes, and you will see submit a veteran tribute, whether for yourself or someone you know. You can fill out this form and scroll to the bottom. You can add pictures. There's a 1 megabyte limit for the pictures, so make sure it's a good size. Submit that, comes right to me. And then we will take that and we add that to our veteran tributes wall. So hopefully this will pop over and you will be able to see our veteran tributes. As you can see, we are just getting started, so we only have 4 to start, but we expect this to expand exponentially as we go into the near future. So as we finally got this up and running, we're excited to present it to you all. It is also in our e-blast, so you'll see it advertised there. Please feel free to submit yourself, like I said, or submit a friend of yours, or submit a family member. We'd love to put a picture of them up on our honor wall. Also, if they are from the Western PA region, there is an organization here in town, Phase 4, and they will be printing up pictures and posting them on their physical wall at their actual headquarters. So thank you so much. Glenn, I hand it off to you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that's really cool. I wasn't even aware of that, Sean. I'm behind the curve in information here. That's really neat. That'll be a great addition to our website. Great addition. So before I introduce Jan, let me recognize Ed Cottrell. Ed, thank you for being on tonight. I think everybody on the Zoom knows Ed now after all these months, but Ed is a World War II veteran, P-47 pilot, 102 years young, and is coming with us to England. And that date is getting closer and closer, Ed. Closer and closer. So we're looking forward to that. I don't think I see any of the other World War II veterans we occasionally have on. No, I'm not scrolling through. I just don't see them. But anyway, welcome everybody to Greatest Generation Live. And tonight we have another fantastic guest. And thanks to Marilyn Walton. Marilyn, please wave and say hello.
Hello.
Marilyn has become our best introducer of guests. I don't know if that's an official category, but we're going to make one for you, Marilyn. Thank you.
I'll have a sign made.
You've been very good. One thing before Jan, now I remember something else. Is Greg Yost on yet? Greg? No? Okay.
I don't know if I saw Greg's. Yes, I do see Greg.
Okay. Greg, can you, I don't think your picture's up, but can you speak?
Yes, I am. I apologize. I don't have the camera computer tonight, but yes, I think you wanted me to mention that there is. Yes, that is exactly what it is. There is a there are several of these organizations that fly real B-17s, B-24s, B-25s, B-29s to various airports around the United States. And they stay at the different airports for several days. One of those organizations has a B-17 and a B-25 out at the Allegheny County Airport here in Pittsburgh through Sunday. It's like $15 to visit or $30 for a family of four or something like that. I've gone to several of these, and they are all the times we've talked this year about the Masters of the Air and the air war over Europe, to actually step into a B-17 and walk through it and see what those people went through and how cramped it was and where the tail gunners were and everything like that, I think is a valuable experience. I would encourage people to go out to see this. I know they are probably at other places throughout the country. So if, I apologize for the non burgers here, non Pittsburghers here, but I think if you do some Google searches, you can find some of these. I would encourage people to check these out. They're usually not at the major airports in your region. They're usually at sort of a small regional airport. For example, this one is not at the Greater Pittsburgh International Airport. It's at the Allegheny County Airport. Glenn, I know, the air war over Europe has been your theme all year long. I think that you've seen some of these and you've toured some of these, and I think you would highly recommend this. So.
Absolutely, highly recommend. It's been a long time, but I was out at the airport 20 years ago. I can't remember when, and I walked through a B-17. I'm going to do the same thing Saturday or Sunday. I'm not sure which. I'm going to go and see it again. And this organization does, if you check their website, they go to a different airport every weekend, almost all year long. And then just one note, there's also an organization that flies a B-29 around the country. And I've been just initially in touch with them about trying to arrange the B-29 to come to Pittsburgh. And the only thing I'm lacking are a few tens of thousands of dollars. Once we figure out the money side, once Brad writes me a check, then we'll get the B-29 here maybe next year.
Well, Glenn, here's what I'm thinking. Since this is a 1945 aircraft, the B-29, why don't you pay them in 1945 dollars?
There you go. I could even
$1,000 would be something like $450 or something. So
that
don't think it works that way.
Okay. Well, thank you, Greg, for bringing that to our attention. I know a couple of other people did too. So let's get started with our guest, Jan Davis. Jan, please just wave and say hello for us.
Hi.
Introduce.
Hello, everyone.
Introduced, as I said earlier, by Marilyn a few weeks ago, a month ago. And Jan has written a book called Airborne. She'll be showing that to you in just a minute. And we sort of get this is like a double header tonight. You for the price of one, you're going to get two great stories. The one great story is about Jan's father, who was a B-17 pilot in World War II with the 8th Air Force. Very special kind of pilot, which I'll leave for Jan to describe what that was all about. Shot down, prisoner of war. And then there's some very special, interesting aspects about his story that is pretty unique among all the stories I've heard and read about over the years. So that's the first half of the doubleheader. And the second half of the doubleheader is Jan herself. Jan is a NASA astronaut, 3-time Space Shuttle astronaut, 3 different missions. And that in itself is a great story. So 2 for the price of 1 tonight. This ought to be really interesting. Thank you, Jan, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. So, Jan, I know you have this excellent PowerPoint. I'll ask you to bring it up, and we'll just get started on it. As you know, as I mentioned, I always ask, what motivated you to write this book? And I know that's part of one of your first 2 or 3 slides. So I'll just let you wait until you get to that second or third slide and explain what motivated you to write this book. Is that okay?
Well, after we talked, I took that slide out, so I'll tell you now.
Okay. Jan, why did you write this book? What motivated you to spend the last few years researching and writing.
Yes, I'll be talking about my father and the story as it relates to me, but I didn't have much contact with him later in life. We'll talk about that. But the only time he ever talked about the war was when he showed me his POW Wartime Log, which was his journal while he was a POW. And he had been a draftsman and an artist, and he loved to write stories and do cartoons. And so he showed me with this wartime log how he was shot down. He painted all those different scenes about how he shot down in his wartime log, in watercolors. And so when he passed, I was pretty sure my sister had that. She was the oldest next to me. And so I contacted her and I said, I would really like a copy of the wartime log when you get a chance. So I received it from her about 4 years after I made that request in April of 2020. So she had time due to the COVID shutdown to scan it and send it to me because it's like 120 pages. And when I looked at that, I said, oh, now I have a project to do during COVID. I need to tell this story. And then as I was doing research, I realized how much there was in common with his story and with my story. So I decided to write a book about both our stories. So that was the motivation for the book. I really wanted to tell his story.
And in the process, your stories, although not physically, they're intertwined in terms of experience, the process of becoming a pilot, in your case, an astronaut as well, which I thought was also just a really interesting aspect of your book.
Right. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, let's get started. I'll let you tell the story.
Okay. Let me pull up those slides. All right. Can you see that?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Yes, so this is the book that I wrote. And by the way, I am not a veteran, but I know there are several online tonight, and I do appreciate your service with heartfelt gratitude. But I came up through the civilian ranks to be an astronaut, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So this is the book that I wrote. It was published last September. And I always like to start off with this slide that shows sort of a combination of the space, the view of space from the view of the Earth from space, from the International Space Station, in this case, of England, which is where my father was stationed in the European Theater of Operations in the 8th Air Force for World War II. So this is, I think, a very cool picture that shows the aurora on the Earth limb. It shows England. And it shows East Anglia, where the 8th Air Force was based. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is about my father, a little bit about the air war. I know this is a very informed audience about that. I won't spend a lot of time on that. Also, Stalag Luft 3 and Stalag 7A, where he was. Glenn suggested I have a stopping point where we can have questions and answers about that portion of the presentation. And then I'll move on to talk about myself, my missions, and sum it up with questions and answers. And throughout, I will sort of talk about the connection between his career and mine, but not just the careers, but also our things that we had in common. So I'll talk about his younger years, my mother, and then his being a pilot. So when he was a young boy, he grew up in Fort Worth, Texas during the Depression. It was a large family, poor family, but he received an airplane ride when he was young. And he was just captured by that. And he decided he wanted to be a pilot and be a pilot, make a living as a pilot. And he knew the only way he could do that was by joining the military. So he joined the junior ROTC in high school. Then after high school, he worked for a couple of years so that he could pay for college and for flying lessons. And so here he is in college at North Texas Agricultural College, which is now University of Texas Arlington. He majored in industrial and aeronautical engineering. And it was a 2-year school at the time. And this is where he met my mother, was at INTAC. She was about 5 years younger than him. She started college when she was 16. And that's where they met and dated and eloped and got married the day before the Pearl Harbor attack. So that changed their lives forever, as it did everyone else's. So he enlisted. I wanted to show this picture. He didn't train in the Stearman, but when he was dating my mother, he flew her around in a Stearman while he was taking flying lessons. And obviously, after he could carry passengers, he would take her on dates in the Stearman over Fort Worth and Dallas. She was from Dallas, so I threw that picture in there. But he enlisted in January of 42 and started his flight training the day after that. His primary training was in Uvalde, Texas, and a PT-19, pictured here with him. And then his basic training after that was in Waco, Texas. I have his flight records, but they did not describe which plane he was flying in basic training. But this is one of the planes like the ones that he flew. And then his advanced training was in Lake Charles in the Texan, the AT-6. All of this took about 9 months. And so he traveled around doing the training. And as you know, each phase of his training had more and more complex aircraft and more instrument procedures, cross-country procedures, etc. And after this 9 months, he received his wings. And here he is with my mother on that day when he received his wings. And he was on track to become a fighter pilot. But at the time, they really needed bomber pilots. So he transitioned over to the multi-engine track. Here he is in his uniform after he got his wings. So he was assigned to fly the B-17. And so he did his transition training for the multi-engine training and combat crew training at Hendricks Field in Sebring, which I was so glad I was able to go there earlier this year. They still have the control tower. They don't use it, but it's still there, and one of the hangars from when he was there. So that was pretty cool. So that's where he got his combat crew training certificate as first pilot. And as you know, the crews of the B-17s, especially the pilots, do gunnery training and bomb training and navigation so that they understand what the other roles on the crew are doing. And this is one of the big similarities between his 10-person crew on the bomber and my 7-person crew on the space shuttle, because we each had a role, but the commander, who is the first pilot, and the pilot, who is actually the co-pilot, they have to understand what we do so that they can, be the commanders of the mission, even though I had my responsibility, whether it was operating the mechanical arm or doing experiments. So we each had our role, but we worked together as a team. And that's really one of the big similarities, I think, between my father's crew and my crew, was that, he had to understand what the different roles did, but he let them do their job. So we had parachute training. I doubt that he had much parachute training. And we had dinghies for the shuttle. And so he had dinghies in the B-17 in case you had to ditch the plane. So, we had some hazardous type activities and training, and we had to accept the risk of flying. For him, flying in combat, for me, flying in space. So I think that acceptance of risk also really gels you as a crew and really helps you develop that camaraderie that we had on the shuttle, and I'm sure he had in the B-17 training. So he was also a pilot for the YB-40. This was a program that he volunteered for, and I think you've had a presentation about this before, but basically the YB-40 was a modified B-17 that had extra guns. It had, you can see here, the twin guns on the waist gunner, which were staggered. These windows were staggered on the YB-40. They weren't on the regular B-17, and later in the F and G B-17s, they had the staggered waist guns. It had an extra turret on top, a different type of turret than the forward turret. It also had a chin turret, which was also later adopted in the B-17G. So there were some things they learned from flying this aircraft, but the idea was for it to be an escort for the B-17s. It did not drop bombs. It had a whole lot of ammunition. It had armor plating in the sides, and the idea, it would lead the formation, and then it would pull out of the formation, and the B-17 would be in the lead when it was near the target to drop the bombs. So the idea was that it would be an escort, but there were only 12 of them made it to Europe. There was one that crashed in Scotland on the way over in the Northern Circle route, but there were 12 that made it. He was the first pilot for a YB-40. And it wasn't successful because it just was too lethargic and too heavy to really be maneuverable and to be a good escort for the B-17. So it didn't have that many missions. It started flying in May of 43, and then, stopped flying in about July of 43. So in fact, the lower right picture was after it had been taken out of combat. They used some of the training aircraft in the U.S. For targets, like these are the P-63. So they use those, not targets, but for training for other aircraft in the United States. So they did try to make good use of them, even though they weren't used in combat anymore. So it's an interesting program that not a lot of people know about. And so they were all in the same squadron, the 327th Squadron of the 92nd Bomb Group, which I'll talk about in a second, the location. So let me talk about the Air War, just a slide or two about the 8th Air Force, and that is the 92nd Bomb Group on the right, in formation, dropping their bombs. And I was impressed when I went to England doing research for this book at how close these bases were. And the little red triangle sort of to the left is Alconbury, where the 92nd was based at the time my father was flying. It was in Bovington before that, and Poddington after, about August of 43. But when he was flying, it was in Alconbury, and that's where all the YB-40s were based. So it's interesting to me how close these bases were, 5-8 miles apart. And they did have collisions, as you know, while they were spiraling up for the formations. I thought I would show you some descriptions of what it was like to fly in the Air War by using the illustrations that he drew in his wartime log. So this is one of the pencil drawings where he's describing flying over in Europe, and actually describing when he was shot down. So just a few pictures of, paintings, I should say, of the flak, the attacks by the Focke-Wulf 190s and the Messerschmitt 109s are what primarily came and attacked him. So that's another painting of what combat was like. And here they are dropping their bombs in unison. So all three of these are in the book, and are part of the Wartime Log drawings and paintings that he did describing his last mission.
And if I could just interject a point here, that this is what I meant by how unique this story is, that I don't know of any other pilot or crewman in combat who drew pictures from their experience while they were in combat. I mean, this is pretty unique material, I think, that we're looking at.
Yes, it's been well received by the curators at World War II Museum and 8th Air Force Museum, as well as Don Miller. I showed them to him when we were traveling in England, and he said, it was well organized and just really told the story well of what life was like in the prison camp and in combat. So he flew 7 combat missions, including the first combat mission to Norway, and he was shot down on his 7th mission. It was to Kassel, Germany, and I just threw this slide in of this picture because I know these missions are not straight lines from Alconbury to their target, and this middle picture is the actual map of it was actually the mission to Norway. I know they're not straight lines. They go to different places to meet up. They have different, alternate targets, and they have usually a different route going than they do coming. I was fortunate to go to Maxwell Air Force Base to the Air Force Historical Research Agency and got all of the records of all of his missions. Each mission, the records were about 300 pages to go through, including maps like this. So I just added this map to show kind of what the maps really look like for one mission and not the straight lines that I have shown. But I just wanted to show that the geography of where he went and the places that he went on his combat missions. So on his last mission, this is another one of his paintings. He thinks it was a cannon that hit the 4th engine. They were relatively new at the time. This was July of 1943, and the damage from that 4th engine hit the 3rd engine and took it out of commission, and he had another one failing. So he had to drop out of formation, and when you do that, you're a sitting duck. He and his co-pilot were madly trying to keep the plane straight and level and fly it while they were still being shot at. And so that was a challenge, and it's pretty well described in his, not in his wartime log, but in a story he wrote for a Dutch magazine after the war. He talked about how harrowing it was to try to fly and he was flying a B-17 on this mission. His YB-40 was damaged on its first combat mission, so he wasn't able to fly that. He flew other YB-40s and flew this B-17, but it was difficult to fly, of course, after he lost 2 engines, was about to lose a 3rd one, and the 4th engine wouldn't feather, so it was really causing a lot of drag. So as I said, he was still being shot at while he was trying to fly the plane and manage the terror of being shot down. And of course, if you've seen Masters of the Year, I'm sure you have, that to me made it come alive, what that must have been like in the cockpit. And, the decision for the commander, the first pilot, to make, do you order a bailout or do you keep flying? So he chose to keep flying and crash landed his plane in Holland. And he was about to hit a town in Holland. And here he is with two engines out and one losing a 3rd one. He did a 180 so that he wouldn't hit the town. He says, I didn't want to kill any Dutch people. And so he did a 180 and landed in a farm that he had flown over. So for that, he got the Distinguished Flying Cross for taking that really dangerous maneuver to land safely, and none of his crew were injured. They after they landed, they were instructed to try to put the plane on fire, but it was too badly damaged, and they couldn't get it on fire. So they decided to split up into teams of two to try to evade the police and try to find the underground. They knew where the underground was, and so that's where they were headed. And they were on the run for about 12 hours before they were captured. And here is his plane in the field in Holland. So then they became, all 10 of them became prisoners of war. I don't have any information other than how long he was at Dulag Luft, but I've read a lot about that. Marilyn helped me with that too. So he was there for about 4 days before he went on the train to Stalag Luft 3. And then I'll talk a little bit about that and the long winter march to Moosburg and then liberation. His wartime log was censored, and I'm pretty sure that's why he didn't include the Dulag Luft and include a lot of other things, and he didn't include drawings of like the guard towers and things like that. So he was very careful of what he painted and what he drew because he didn't want it to be censored and taken from him or pages ripped out, which is what they did if they didn't like something that was in your wartime log. So fortunately, it was all intact. So after Dulag Luft, he went to Stalag Luft 3, which is pictured on the left. The drawing at the bottom is a drawing that he made, and it was pretty big, like 11 by 14 inches. And so that was also with the colored pencils and the watercolors that the YMCA provided. And the wartime log actually came with some colored pencils, but my mother, I have all the customs lists of what she mailed to him, and that's what he asked for were pencils and watercolors. They weren't allowed to have ink, but he did drawings like this, and he did draw a drawing of his room as well. And there's a room pictured above. I think that's probably a Red Cross picture. Everyone looks nice and happy.
Jan, we have a good question in the chat. Was your father trained as an artist before the war?
No, he was not. This is a hobby that he had this hobby of drawing and doing cartoons ever since he was about 10 years old. I have some of those original cartoons that he drew. He did work as a draftsman while he was in the Army Air Corps Reserve before he enlisted. So he worked as a draft. But not any painting experience. So Stalag Luft 3, I thought it was fascinating that the YMCA provided costumes and musical instruments and sports equipment. And so they, the Germans were happy to accommodate all of these things because it kept the prisoners busy and kept them, theoretically from not escaping or thinking about escaping. There were libraries. They taught each other courses. My father helped build a theater. They built the theater out of the seats were out of the wooden boxes that the Red Cross parcels came in. So he helped build that. So that's a play on the left, and I have a couple of the programs from the plays that were produced there, and they're the bands. They had all kinds of sports and they had different leagues. So, they were still in prison, but at least they had these activities to help keep them busy. He liked to read a lot, so he spent time in the library, and he also taught some of the courses. And he did carving and model building, but as you can tell, if you could see the whole Wartime Log, a lot of painting. Something else he was asked to do was to draw a cartoon for the circuit, which was the South Compound's newspaper. And there you see the cartoon at the bottom. The one on the left is what he drew in his Wartime Log, was the very first Penny cartoon. The Penny was a wartime correspondent. And so he drew 90, I have 97 of these cartoon strips. They're about 14 inches wide by, I would say 6 inches or so tall. And so we have those Penny cartoons. He's quite well known for that. You know, in the POW community, a lot of people know about Ben Smotherman's Penny cartoons. And he drew Penny in a lot of other people's wartime logs. So she was very popular. And the long winter march, I think you know about the march in late January through early February from Stalag Luft 3. About 60 miles of it, shown at the top, was on foot, and you know, blizzard, freezing conditions, and they had like a half hour to get ready for it. So they made sleds out of the Red Cross parcels. They actually did, the higher ups did know this could potentially happen, so they were trying to get people to get in shape, you know, walking around the perimeter of the camp and thinking about, you know, what they might take if they had to evacuate. The picture on the left is from his wartime log that he drew of that occasion. It's interesting because after the march, his drawings and his writings were in ink, which he wasn't allowed to have at Stalag Luft 3, but apparently after the march at Stalag 7A in Moosburg, he was allowed to have ink, and that's what's in his book after that. So the picture shown there is from a clandestine camera and film that was smuggled through the, I think you had a presentation on the coders who, you know, they talked about how specially marked packages that were sent to supposedly sent to families actually had film in them disguised in a baseball or camera parts, or they made, you know, they were very resourceful in how they were able to take pictures like this and get the film developed. So after they marched to Spremberg, they were put on these rail cars, and the South Compound was the first group to lead. So just thousands of men were marched through this blizzard condition and then packed into these rail cars in just awful conditions. I think he was on the rail car for about 2.5 days down to Moosburg. But on April 29th, was liberated by Patton's Third Army, which, you know, there's a Jeep under there. And Moosburg was highly overcrowded. You know, it was a lot more prisoners than what it was designed for. So people were living in ditches and in tents. From the records I have, which are not in the wartime log, he took notes in a little, must have been a little notepad that he carried, because he probably had his wartime log and the penny cartoons wrapped up and bundled up somehow where he could not access them to write. So he took notes of where he was staying, which barrack he was in. So I think he was in barracks rather than tents. And then later, when he had time, he pulled out his wartime log and added these pen and ink cartoons, which the very bottom one there shows Happy Day of Liberation. And one of the big deals was seeing the American flag raised and the Nazi flag taken down. And Marilyn gave me some good information about that and how that happened. It was just, you know, ecstatic and emotional for the prisoners. He wasn't able to leave that camp for about a week or so before he went to the other places, the ramp camps, where he was ready to go overseas in a ship. So he came back about about a month later. He was on one of the first ships back, because they tried to bring the POWs who had been there a long time back first before the other armed forces over in Europe. So that is the conclusion about the prisoner of war and the World War II portion of my father. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have about that part.
Okay, excellent. Let me ask you to stop the share so we can sort of see the view with
Okay.
Everybody on the Zoom call. There we go. Okay. Okay, Sean, any questions in the chat room that we should address?
Let's see here. Nancy Smoyer put in, I'm not sure if this was answered, any story of why they were unable to hook up with the Dutch underground during those 12 hours?
Yes, he knew where they were, and he wrote about that later in this story that he wrote for the Dutch journalist, and they were headed that way. But they were trying to travel at night. He was captured, he was shot down about noon, and wasn't captured, like I said, for about 12 hours. So they just didn't make it. They actually landed in the headquarters of the police. They were trying to open doors of different places, and they opened the door to the police. So they were captured before they made it to the underground.
And Brad, I'm assuming this is from the picture of looking down at the UK with the, yes. So what altitude is that picture taken from?
That's taken from the International Space Station, which the altitude varies a little bit, but around 250 to 300 miles above the Earth, as is the picture behind me, taken from Space Station.
And Greg,
I'm sorry. Is there another question?
Greg Yost raised his hand.
Yes, thank you so much, Jan. This is a great story. Much of this year has been concentrated on the Thursday nights have been concentrated on the air war over Europe. This is a great contribution to that whole story there. I might be getting ahead a little bit, but my question for you is, did your father live long enough into your astronaut years? And what did he think of that? And once again, that might be a little ahead of the story.
Yes, I'm going to get into that a little bit. He, he was alive when I was selected, and was very excited about that. But he passed away the summer before I flew in September of 1992. So he didn't get to see me fly, but at least not from the Earth. But he was certainly aware of my being an astronaut. Yeah.
I have a real long shot sort of question here, Jan. I didn't think about it when you and I spoke a day or two ago. Did your father ever meet or think of or say anything about Charles Schulz, the World War II vet who became the comic strip writer for Peanut?
He did not mention that to me. No.
Just a
He
little
really didn't.
twist or two.
He just didn't talk much. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Ed Cottrell had his hand up.
I'd like to ask you, was there any evidence that you ever found out that anybody was mistreated in the various prison camps that he served? Or was it all pretty much like you described?
Well, for the officers, there's only officers in Stalag Luke 3. So you had the bombardier, the navigator, the two pilots.
Okay.
Those were the people who were in Stalag Luke 3. And they weren't allowed to work. Officers weren't allowed to work. And in some of the other prison camps, and especially where the countries did not sign the Geneva Convention, the prisoners weren't treated so well. So Germany did signed the Geneva Convention, and he was an officer, so he was treated well. And Marilyn could probably answer better how the non-commissioned officers were treated, but the non-commissioned officers were allowed to work as long as it was not war-related work. But I think the officers were treated better than anyone else. So I think he was in the best possible place he could be. And by the way, he had P-47 escorts. So I've never met a P-47 pilot. So that's great to have that support.
I had a question.
Yeah, Mary?
I have two questions, actually. Your dad's artwork, he did a lot of sketches and planes and what he saw. Did he ever do portraits? There were a lot of artists in camp who did each other's portraits, and you could pay some D-bars, chocolate D-bars for doing portraits. Did he, in his logbook, did he do portraits as well?
Yes, yes, he did.
Yeah.
When he was going through it with me, he intended to, and he allotted pages for all of his roommates, portraits of his roommates.
Oh.
But he only did 2 of them. So
yeah,
those are the only ones that he did.
my other question is something that he couldn't put in his log. Since he was such a good artist, do you know if he ever worked as a forger, making the fake documents and all? He wouldn't have been able to mention that. I just wondered if after the war he had been, because they tried to get as many artists
I wondered that
as they could. He went down early enough. He could have been.
I wondered, because yes, exactly. And he was in the same compound as Bub Clark, who was, in charge of all of that. So
yeah.
I don't know. And Albert Clark put a list of people who helped different parts of the escape planning and execution, and forgers and artists and people who made clothes, and he had lists of that kind of stuff in a reference that I saw, and my father's name was not in that list. However, knowing this talent that he had, I can't imagine that that he wasn't used for maps or something, because he loved to draw. I mean, even in his later years, he loved to draw maps. So I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, there's another aspect of your father that you've not mentioned yet, and I don't think it's in this presentation, but I'd like to mention it from the book. Your father not only was a professional level artist, but also his writing and his in his logbook and his wartime journal are just fascinating. And you have lots of those entries in your book that help support the story as it goes along.
Yes, thank you. I think he's a good writer, and he documented well in a journal he was writing to my mother before he was shot down, and I have that journal, and so I used a lot of quotes from what he wrote to my mother as he was going through his combat missions, and I have letters that he wrote to his family, and thankfully those were saved. So. Yes, I think he writes well, and it really helps tell the story.
Yeah, it does. The book is really, it's a good book overall, but it's further enhanced by both the stories that he tells and his paintings.
Yes, thank you.
It's interesting too that he got the logbook back, because so many didn't. They dropped them along during the march. They couldn't. They were too, and he had a big one. To carry it that far and get it home was an accomplishment right there, and it showed the importance that he felt about that logbook. So hopefully when you're all done with it, you can scan it to Merrick at the museum. He loves logbooks. And they're all unique, each one. I've seen quite a few of them, and they're really unique. A lot of them burned to stay warm, on the first stop out of South Compound. So
yes, it's tragic. And he writes in his letters that a lot of people just dropped them off, just to lighten their load. They just left them along the road, and then of course they burned the pages for built when they were building fires to stay warm. So I'm thankful that he kept his intact, and he was able to keep it, like he said. And the penny cartoons.
Yeah, there was another artist, Holmstrom, that was there, and I was working on that book. And he drew a lot of portraits. And one that he drew, in fact, when he went on the march, instead of taking a lot of food, he'd throw away food before his artwork that he carried out. He had all rolled up and carried, and a lot of it got home, not all of it. But I was going through pictures for the book, and one of the pictures he drew was of Bucky Egan with a mustache. And nobody had seen it before. So I sent it to Bucky's family, to the 100th Bomb Group, and they said they'd never known him to have a mustache before. So you never know what's going to crop up. When you look in these old logbooks, you find a lot of good stuff.
Question
It
from
was
Brad.
interesting when I visited Mooseburg, there was an art exhibit of art that had been done by the prisoners of war.
Yeah.
So there was really talented people.
Very talented. Very talented.
Yeah.
Question from Brad in the chat.
So
did your dad go back to Europe after the war to visit people and sites from the war?
He was stationed in Germany, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But yes, I went with him. I was born at that point. So my guess is he did look people up in Germany, but I don't know. He never talked about it.
And Bob von Bargen asks, has there been a gallery showing off the artwork?
No, there has not.
But
I mean, he did other artwork other than what's in the Wartime Log. And after the war, and I have an example here, he drew Western art. So I don't know if that ever was displayed, in a gallery or in an art show or anything. But the only art we have from the war is what's in the Wartime Log.
But the punchline here at the very end is Jan's coming out with a second book that will feature all this artwork. So we'll get to that at the end. And we probably ought to move on to the second of this. But Jan, before you do that, Jan, Sean, why don't we take the station break now so that then we can get Jan to go forward and finish the second part.
Sure thing. Let me pull up our sponsors here. First of all, we'd like to thank tobacco-free Adagio Health. They are dedicated to preventing and reducing tobacco use, educating people about tobacco hazards, and advocating for healthier places to live, work, and play. You can find out everything that they have to offer at tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org or call their popular quit line 1-800-QUIT-NOW. We'd also like to thank UPMC for Life for sponsoring the VBC. They can help you make sense of Medicare, get the answers and information you need, such as how to choose the Medicare Advantage plan that's right for you. UPMC for Life has plans designed by veterans for veterans that can save you money and get you more benefits. And you can view all their plan options by going to upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. We also have the next VBC magazine coming out to your mailboxes probably in the next couple of weeks. It is at the printer now. This will be a special edition that's going to cover a lot of what we've covered on our Thursday night programs, the Masters of the Air specifically. So we're taking a lot of the stories that we've heard, and Todd, as a labor of love, has printed them down into a really wonderful to read magazine. If you don't get this magazine, it's because we don't have your address. Just send that to us, either at Todd@veteransbreakfastclub.org or myself, Sean, SHAUN, @veteransbreakfastclub.org. And we will make sure to get you a free magazine. There's also going to be a survey that I will put into the chat. It takes about 2 to 3 minutes, and we watch these very closely. So please, you have a moment, fill out the survey. Let us know what you think of this program. And then as a reminder that next week we have Glenn. Yay! We've been given a Liberty Pass. So there is no Monday night program, nor is there a Thursday night program. So party it up. Watch some fireworks Thursday night instead of being on with us. But we will definitely be back the following week for open conversation on Monday, July 8th. So again, no programs next week. And as a side note here in the chat, Eric Montgomery put, I don't know if you saw this as well, Glenn, but Ed Cottrell will be formally presented with the French Legion honor. I'm sure I always mispronounce that. The honor, d'honneur, on July 9th. Was it? Eric helped look at his rejected application, submit a revision, and a few weeks later, Ed, congratulations. You're going to receive this honor. And I thought we would just say thank you to Eric for doing the legwork there and congratulate Ed on this wonderful honor.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Eric.
Yes.
Great, Ed. Okay, let's move on to part 2, and that's the story from outer space. Well, okay, space from the Space Shuttle.
Okay. So I'll talk about myself a little bit growing up and what led up to my career as an astronaut. I wanted to mention that after the war, my father stayed in the Air Force. And so, well, it became the Air Force in 1947. It was Army Air Forces, and then became the Air Force. Here he is in his Air Force uniform as a captain. And he worked on the Matador, which was surface-to-surface missile that was developed at the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. Now it's the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. It had a solid rocket propellant on the bottom, and on the upper right you see one that he named after my mother, Dolly Joe. So while he was at Canaveral Air Force Station and lived at or worked at Patrick Air Force Base, which is now Patrick Space Force Base, my parents lived in Cocoa Beach, and I was born there while he was working there. So it's interesting that he worked in the initial, missile and space part of the Air Force at what later became Kennedy Space Center. So it was full circle for me to be born there at the hospital at Patrick Air Force Base. So here he is with me right after I was born. That's their home in Cocoa Beach, and that was my first Christmas. So then this is a picture of me with my mother at my first birthday. And this was at her parents' house in Dallas, Texas, because my father had just been deployed to Germany. So they were deploying the Matador over in Europe to help fight, the war that potentially could happen in Europe. So he was stationed in Germany. So I spent my toddler years at Landstuhl Air Force Base. He was at Landstuhl and Ramstein, so I'm not sure exactly which one where I lived, because they both, I think Landstuhl was first built. But so there I am growing up in Germany. And when I was about 4 years old, I'm not sure what happened, but my mother and father separated. So my mother and I came back to the United States. My father stayed in Germany, and they divorced a year later. So that's why I mentioned, I wasn't around him a lot. After the divorce, my mother remarried, and my stepfather really didn't want me associating with my father or spending time with him. So we mostly communicated by telephone and letters. So I have all of the letters that he wrote to me, which are very special, and I've included some of those in the book. So after my mother remarried, and my stepfather is also from Texas, so we did go to Texas quite a bit on holidays. This was a Christmas I was there, and I got to see my father usually at Christmas, maybe once a year I saw him. But when I was growing up, I liked to take things apart and figure out how things work and build things. So maybe I was destined to be an engineer. This is the kind of toy I like. I mean, I had dolls and stuff too, but I really like these sort of engineering toys. So when I was about 10 years old, my mother and stepfather moved to North Alabama, to Huntsville, Alabama. They moved here as part of the space boom that was occurring in Huntsville. They weren't associated with the space program. They were both psychologists, but they needed psychologists in Huntsville. So we moved to Huntsville. And my big activity growing up was ice skating, figure skating. So this is a picture of me figure skating in those early years, my formative years there in Huntsville. My father remarried and had 3 children with his second marriage. And he his next deployment or next assignment was in California at Vandenberg. Again, part of this, one of the first officers to be at Vandenberg, associated with the space program there at Vandenberg. And he turned his attention towards Western art. So he did a lot of paintings, oil paintings and drawings. He liked to draw maps, but he also liked to do research about Western stagecoaches and build them from scratch. And so he built probably 7 or 8 of these stagecoaches. I have one of them. And everything works in these stagecoaches, the brakes, the springs, the steering mechanisms. And he built them, like I said, from scratch, the leather and the metal. And it's just amazing, the detail. And for example, one of those wheels is one piece of wood that he carved out the spokes out of it. So he spent a lot of time doing that as a bachelor, I guess, after he moved to California. And then he stayed in the Air Force and was commander of a base in New Hampshire, which is where this picture was taken. And he retired as a colonel in the Air Force. Meanwhile, I was in college. I actually started college about the time he retired from the Air Force. Went to Georgia Tech first with a degree in bioengineering, and then Auburn with a degree in mechanical engineering. And the jobs were in the oil industry at the time. So I went to work for Texaco for a couple of years before. Oh, I meant to mention this was the only picture I have of the 3 of us, my mother and my father and me. We were visiting, my mom and I were visiting her parents in Dallas, and I asked her if I could invite him over. So he came over, and that's the only picture I have of all of us. And that's would have been probably mid to late 70s. So after Texaco, NASA was hiring, getting ready for Space Shuttle. The first Space Shuttle flight was in 1981. And so I was assigned to work as structures engineer on the Hubble Space Telescope, which was fantastic, at the Marshall Space Flight Center here in Huntsville. And about that time, they started picking women astronauts. So I thought, wow, that'd be something I'd really like to try. I think that'd be the phenomenal job. And so I did things like become a pilot, learning to fly. This is actually my own airplane, a 172. So I got my pilot's license and continued graduate school and earned a PhD. So it was great that I was able to go to school at night while working full-time at NASA. But then the government has a full-time study program where you can go to school full-time for a year. For me, it was a year and a half, and they pay your salary and your tuition. So that was what enabled me to get my degree. So that was in 1985. I received my degree. I interviewed to be astronaut in 1984, but was not selected. But I felt pretty good because there were 8,000 applicants and they only interviewed 128 people. So that really motivated me to finish my PhD. And I wasn't selected in 85, but I was selected in 1987 on my 3rd try. And my mother said when I called, she was the first person I called, she said, put God first in your country and go for it. And I think this is another parallel between me and my father. I'm almost certain that she told him the same thing when he was sent overseas to Europe to fight and fly in the war. She's a very positive person, and I can just picture her saying that to him as he was getting ready to fly overseas. And I have the Bible that she gave to him when he left. So let's talk about what being an astronaut is like after that selection in 1987. And in the book, I talk a good bit about astronaut training and what that was like, and some of the similarities between what my father went through in his training and what I did. That bottom picture is my first flight in a T-38 jet. You can see we're wearing our parachutes. So that's a high altitude. We're flying at high altitudes, much higher than B-17, because we do have some pressure in the T-38. The B-17s didn't have any. They were unpressurized. But, you know, had to wear oxygen. So I've often wondered about hypoxia, if he got hypoxia training. I don't think they did in those days, but we did. But still, it's a hazardous environment. You have to deal with breathing oxygen while you're flying, as well as ejection. We had ejection seats and a lot of training that he didn't have, but still similar in that things are happening pretty fast and you have to really think on your feet, or fly by the seat of your pants, if you will, as he did. The left is a picture of the KC-135 zero gravity training that we did. Of course, we did have parachute training. We were never dropped out of an airplane, but we were trained at the Air Force bases on water survival. So we were dunked in the water and dragged through the water and had to flip over and release our parachute. We had wilderness survival training, also how to do signals, how to do flares. So I know a lot of that was similar to what he had as well, even though it's a different era. Some of those basics were still trained by those World War II crews. And there's my myself in an extravehicular activity suit. This is the actual suit. Most of our training is done underwater and with training suits because that closely simulates floating in space. But this picture is actually the actual suit that was in a vacuum, and that was how we tested it to make sure it was ready to go. And so I was the EVA crew member on my first 2 flights. However, I did not do a spacewalk because we trained for contingencies. We didn't have any planned EVAs on my flights, but still. So I trained as a mission specialist. So the pilot astronauts were all military test pilots. The mission specialists, and they fly the shuttle. Basically, they fly the shuttle and the rendezvous and that kind of thing. And then the mission specialists do the spacewalks. They operate the Canadian arm, which I did, and the experiments and whatever it takes, excuse me, to do the mission. Sorry.
So take your time. I've had the same cold for the past week.
I've had a scratch today.
Well, she
So here's a space shuttle.
It's never been. She's fine.
I'm sorry.
I'll wait.
So this was the space shuttle. We had the 2 solid rocket boosters stay on for about 2 minutes. And that's where you really get the dynamic shaking vibration noise, is from those 2 boosters. So they stay on for about 2 minutes. And then the fuel for these 3 engines is in this tank. So we had liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen that fuels those engines. So after 2 minutes, these come off the solids. And then the external tank stays on. And these engines stay on for another 6.5 minutes. So after 8.5 minutes, you're in space.
And
That's all it takes.
how many G's? What was the maximum amount of G forces that you would have had?
Only 3 Gs. Only 3 Gs.
Huh.
So the initial booster is about 2 Gs, and then it drops to 0, and then it ramps as the whole shuttle accelerates. It ramps up to 3 Gs, and then on entry you feel about 2 Gs.
Okay.
So these are my 3 missions. I'm not going to go into detail. I'll just tell you a little bit about them. This first mission, can you see my cursor when
We
I
can.
move it?
We are.
Okay, good. So this was a mission with the Japanese, the first Japanese that flew on the Space Shuttle, and we flew in 1992. So I spent several months in Japan training for that mission with their scientists. Basically, we did material science and life science experiments. We had a big module in the back of the shuttle. Mamoru Mori was the astronaut who flew with us. And this was the second flight of Endeavour. So this was September of 1992. And as I said, my father wasn't alive, but the summer he was in the hospital, he died of lung cancer. I mean, they smoked constantly in those days. He did, either cigarettes or pipe. Anyway, I flew over in a T-38 to San Antonio where he was in the hospital. And my pilot was an Air Force astronaut, and he was thrilled to talk with a B-17 pilot. And of course, my father was thrilled to talk with an Air Force pilot. So that was the last time I saw him, but it was a really nice visit. And he got to see me in my NASA flight suit and everything. So, but he didn't get to see my space flight. So my second flight was the first time that a Russian had flown on the space shuttle. And this was right after the Soviet Union had collapsed. So this was a really big deal. We had a smaller module called the Space Hab on that flight. And I operated the arm. And we were deploying it's about an 8-foot diameter device that was growing very thin film crystals for semiconductors. So they were of crystals, and we had some other experiments in the back. So that was in 1994 on Discovery. And then my third mission was the one at the bottom. I was the payload commander, which means I was in charge of the mission and planning it, training, executing it, deciding who was doing what, everything but flying the shuttle. So that was my favorite mission. I really enjoyed. We had 4 rookies, and I really enjoyed mentoring them, and we had a great time. We had a lot of astronomy payloads. So we were looking at the sun, we're looking at Jupiter, we're looking at hell. German satellite that looked at ozone levels through the atmosphere. Our astronomy payloads, most of them were in the back. And Japanese arm, I also operated, so went back to Japan for training, which was fantastic to go back there. So this was in 1997, again on Discovery. I'm just going to show you one picture from each mission, just to kind of tell you why we go to space. And there I am, just to prove I was up there. And I really enjoyed it. It was the favorite thing to do was to look out the window. It was a beautiful view. We weren't quite as high as the space station. We were probably about 210, 220 miles above the Earth. We go around the Earth every hour and a half. So 16 orbits a day. So I had 2 12-day missions and 1 8-day mission. So this was before space station, so I didn't get to spend months in space, but I didn't get sick. I really enjoyed it. I had 3 great crews and very successful missions. This is on the flight deck. The arm is operated over here. This hand controller and the one behind me actually flies. You can fly the shuttle from back here when you're doing a rendezvous. So this is from my first mission, and this is one of the material science experiments that we were performing. We had about 35 Japanese material science experiments and life science, but mostly material science. So you go to space doing material science because without gravity, you can do a lot of basic research about the dynamics of how materials are formed. And you can also make new materials that you can't make on the Earth. You can melt things, mix them together, solidify them, so you can make materials that are not possible to make on the Earth. So we spend a lot of time doing material science on the shuttle and now space station. So this is one of the furnaces that we had. And all that paraphernalia on my head is from another experiment. It's an American experiment, a biofeedback experiment. I was the control for that. So that's why I'm wearing all that gear. This is from my second flight, and this is my very favorite experiment. It doesn't look like much, but it's called protein crystal growth. And so the protein crystal growth experiment grows perfect crystals of proteins. Your body's made up of proteins, and if they know the structure of a protein, then they can look at, we bring the crystals back, and they make a 3-dimensional computer model using X-ray diffraction to, look at the crystal and create this model. And I went to the scientists' labs, and you can see in this 3-dimensional computer model exactly where a pharmaceutical should attach to the protein so that some disease or virus or bad bug doesn't attach to the protein. So that's why the pharmaceuticals are very interested in this technology, and I did it on every one of my shuttle flights, and we're doing it on space station. But this particular experiment that I'm doing was growing a crystal of insulin. We didn't know what insulin looked like in 1994. And when this picture was made, my crystal had started growing, and I was supposed to go to bed. And I said, no, I can't. The ground was trying to tell me, mission control, to go to bed. And I was like, no, I have to grow this crystal. So I had to do some things differently and work with the scientists to make sure we had the right conditions to continue to grow this crystal. And we did get a perfect crystal of insulin, which made great breakthroughs in diabetes research and knowing insulin look like. In fact, I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago, and one of the scientists from this experiment came up to me, and he said, one of the really interesting things they learned was because this crystal was forming in solution, they could tell how insulin gets absorbed. And so they're able to, since they know how insulin is formed and how it grows, they could tell how it gets absorbed into the body. So he said that was another big breakthrough, which I hadn't heard before. Anyway, so I was just really happy to be part of this team and, helping people. This was from my third flight, and this is the Japanese arm controls that I mentioned. So the Japanese arm we were flying was a 6-foot long, small, it's called a small fine arm. And they were getting ready to put it on space station. This was in 1997. We started building the space station in 1998. And they wanted to make sure that it worked. And so when they were going to install it on the International Space Station, there were no windows on the space station. So you had to use camera views to create, the views in order to operate the arm. And so that's what I'm doing here, is operating the arm. I can't look out the window. I have to, and somebody was looking out the window, but it wasn't me. Operate the arm just using these computer views. And then the 6-foot long arm is now on the end of a 50-foot arm. So the big arm takes it to a general location, and then the small fawn arm is used to pick up experiments, put them in the airlock, etc. So we tested it on this flight and it worked great. And again, I spent a lot of time in Japan. I was MS1, that's why I have the MS1 headband on. That's Ichiban, MS number 1. So all 3 of mine, my missions landed where they were supposed to. By the way, they all launched on time, the first minute of the first day of the launch window, and they all landed at Kennedy Space Center. So the landing dynamic is a lot different than launch, obviously, but it's interesting because about a half an orbit before you land, you turn the shuttle around. We call this part of the shuttle the orbiter, to slow the orbiter down before it goes through the atmosphere. So then it flip it back around, it goes through the atmosphere with the black tiles facing the friction that there's a lot of heat as you come through the atmosphere due to friction. And then they start doing a series of S turns to increase the drag on the vehicle. It's a glider at this point. There are no engines on, and it's just falling like a rock. Of course, it's energy management training is what the pilot and commander have to do to get ready for this. As a crew member, there was a lot of buffeting. As you enter the atmosphere, you feel about 2.5 Gs, but your vestibular system isn't working very well because your vestibular system uses fluid and gravity to keep your balance. Of course, that's not working since you've been in 0 gravity for a couple of weeks. We drink a lot of salt water so we don't get lightheaded, because in space, you lose fluid from your extremities. And so we drink a lot of salt water so we don't get lightheaded when we land. But all successful landings, as I said, the commander actually does fly the orbiter on the way in and land. So those are my 3 missions. What we're doing now in NASA, among other things, but I did work on the International Space Station. After I left the astronaut office, I became an executive with NASA, and part of the work I did was on the International Space Station. And after I did that for NASA, I retired from the government and went to work for contractors. And we worked on this Artemis rocket, which the first flight was September of 22, and we'll be flying to the moon next year, taking 4 people to the moon, orbiting the moon, and taking people further than they've ever been before. The 3rd mission of Artemis will land people on the moon, so that's something to look forward to. And one of the 4 crew members will be a woman going to the moon, so the first woman going to the moon. So, Glenn, do I have time to go over my bonus things?
Why don't we go to questions first, okay? Then if we have time, okay, we'll come back to the bonus. Let me ask you to take the share down and see what kind of conversation we can get into.
Okay, well, let me just show this one and then I'll take it down. We'll advertise. Yeah. So as Glenn mentioned, I'm going to publish the entire Wartime Log and all 97 of the penny cartoons and this second book that I'm currently in production. So you can do pre-orders. It should be out this fall, but I'm very excited about this. There's a lot of interest in the artwork and the writings that he did in the Wartime Log, as well as the penny cartoons.
That will be special.
So be looking for that. So I will stop. Yeah. And I'm annotating the Wartime Log because, he couldn't talk about a lot of things. So I'm sort of annotating what he has in there. Okay.
Excellent, Jan. Thank you. That's what a career. You're to be congratulated. I don't know. As you said earlier, you're not a military veteran, but you're certainly a veteran of NASA. And I'm not sure there's too much difference there. So we already have a hand up. Who is that with their hand up?
Joe McCarthy.
Joe McCarthy.
Sean and Glenn, thanks for another wonderful program. And Jan, kudos to you for your wonderful career as a trend-setting astronaut, a pioneer. Just had a couple quick questions. When you were flying with, hope I got this right, Sergei Perkalev, he was the astronaut, wasn't he the astronaut that was flying Mir when the Soviet Union dissolved? So he
Yes,
was like,
that was Sergei.
he was in space like 10 months, and his
That was
country.
Sergei. So I flew with Sergei Krikalev. Yeah, well,
Krikalev.
he tells the story a little bit differently, but so he had 2 missions before I flew with him. He had it on this the Soviet space station. So he had a 10-month mission and a 5-day mission, and he was flying when the Soviet Union collapsed, basically. And they asked him if he would stay. He was by himself, and he said that he would. So they would have gone to get him, but he volunteered to stay. So I don't know, where the truth lies, but yes, he was the one that was up there by himself when the Soviet Union collapsed.
Did he talk about that when you were flying with him? And was there any concern that, the Cold War just ended a couple years before you flew with him? So once bitter rivals were now flying together as crewmen, was there any concern from NASA and you personally about how this is going to work?
Well, the whole arrangement was coordinated with NASA and Gorbachev. So I'll leave it to those folks to worry about the concerns. As far as the cosmonauts and us working together and training together, there was no problem at all. We got along great. Sergei spoke really good English. His backup was Volodya Titov, who did not speak much English. But my commander was Charlie Bolden, who was a Marine aviator. And he said that he and Volodya, the backup, were trying to kill each other, which is true. But we all became friends. We did a lot of social activities with our families and our training team. So we really became very close. So no problems.
Thank you.
Other questions from the audience?
From Susan, and we have a couple other hands raised. Marilyn, I'll get to you in a sec. Susan, what do you do in your present position? What company do you work for?
Well, I'm pretty much retired, which is why I had just retired January of 20 when COVID hit. And I was planning a lot of travel, didn't get to travel, so I wrote a book. But I am doing some part-time work as a consultant for NASA.
And Marilyn, go ahead.
Yes, this is not a technical question in any way. In your book, you were talking about training and your wilderness training, and you alluded to the fact that you took some extra snacks with you to wilderness training. And I just wondered what they were, what you took, because I would have done the same thing. What did you survive on out in wilderness training?
Well, it wasn't just one snack. So
I figured.
We went shopping before we hit the wilderness training. So we had lots of, let's just say, liquid and solid snacks.
These were clandestinely taken?
Yeah, no. Even though it was at Fairchild, it was at an Air Force base. It was run by Air Force people. We weren't, we didn't have to.
Not like boot camp.
Be as strict. Just like the water survival picture in the book of us building a pyramid in our raft.
Yeah.
So
you had fun. Yeah. You mentioned being strapped down to sleep in your bed, and it just sounded so claustrophobic. And I wondered, when they test to see who's going to go up, is there any test for claustrophobia?
Yes.
Tight quarters. How did they test you for that?
Well, they zipped us up in a 3-foot diameter ball.
Oh, that's right. I read about in the book. So that was for claustrophobia. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
we
had air. We had air and we had communication. We had to sit there for 30 minutes. You're kind of just sitting there like in a karma position, and was very relaxing. Totally black,
Also relaxing.
but that's how they.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Speaking of relaxing, Greg Yost asks, is zero gravity really as relaxing as it seems like it would be?
Yes, it is. For me, it was a great environment. I mean, it's just so easy to get around, and you can transfer things just by kind of tossing them to somebody. And once you get used to, working in that environment, you have to hold on when you turn something, or you will spin. So, you get used to it, but it's a really nice environment to work in, and I enjoyed it. It was fun.
I have a question along the same lines. What is sleeping like in zero gravity? Is that hard to get used to?
Well, I think it would be, except that we were just exhausted. We worked really hard. Things don't always go like they're supposed to. So we had long days, and we sleep in sleeping bags. And, I would strap the pillow to my head because I like to have something solid under my head. But when I on my first mission, I had to go to sleep like 2 hours after we got on orbit because we had two shifts. We had 2-shift operations. Someone was always awake, and it's interesting. We did our sleep shifting before the mission while we were quarantined. You're quarantined a week before the mission. We did our sleep shifting with lights. Bright lights helped us to shift. So didn't have any trouble sleeping, even though I had to go to sleep like 2 hours after I got on orbit.
Sean, anything else from anybody? It's about the witching hour.
If people take a look in the chat, Eric put in a nice thing about to thank you to Jan, and that he was watching a live feed from the International Space Station, was lucky enough to capture some of the sunrises. He put that into YouTube, that he put the link in there in the chat. And yeah, I think that's it.
Okay.
Oh, Steve.
Someone had his hand up. I don't know.
Yeah, Steve. There he is. Steve, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brad, for seeing that.
Jan, thank you very much. I'm curious, have you stayed in touch with many of the astronauts, and what are those meetings like?
Yes, of course, you get very close to your class. I had a class of 15 people, and your crews. So you're very close to your crews. So we stay in touch. Sometimes we have our own get-togethers, but the astronauts as a whole in the United States have a reunion every 2 years. So we actually have one in December. We sort of catch up with what's going on in the program, get to see each other. And then there's a conference every year for anybody who's flown in space of one orbit or more. So the people who are suborbital are not part of that, but so we have cosmonauts and people from around the world, and we have this conference every year in a different country. This year it's in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, so I'm going to go to my father's crash site while I'm there.
Very good.
Excited about that.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I think we should wrap it up. Sean, are you okay with that?
Yes, sir.
Jan, thank you so very much. It's been a very special evening. 2 very interesting stories. And thank you for being with us, Marilyn. Thank you for introducing us to Jan. And
Let's do it.
Yes. Yes.
once
Thank you.
that second book comes out, we'd like to get that and take a deeper dive into your father's artwork. What an incredibly talented man. What a courageous man. Wow. You inherited some really good DNA, Jan.
Yes, I did. And thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this and your questions. And so I really appreciate you inviting me. And thank you, Marilyn, for the introduction.
Oh, that was wonderful to hear you. Wonderful to see you.
Thanks to all. Everybody have a great 4th of July week, because we'll be off next week, as Sean said. Sean, happy 4th of July.
You as well. Thank you all. See you on July 8th. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.